The hush in the room was so deep, you could hear the soft clink of a spoon against porcelain, until a little boy in leg braces asked a waitress to dance. On a crisp spring evening in the heart of Manhattan, the most exclusive fine dining restaurant, the Pendleton fell under an unusual stillness. Conversations halted. Cutlery froze in mid-air. All eyes turned toward a small boy standing between tables, his legs trembling in metal braces. 10-year-old Ethan Whitman, son of billionaire financier Charles Whitman, was reaching out a shaky hand, not for a glass of water, but to ask someone to dance. The live piano had just begun a soft melody, and from deep within him, a sudden impulse had risen to be seen, not pitied. He looked directly at the only black waitress in the room, Maria Thompson. Before Maria could respond, the restaurant's manager barked coldly, "Sir, control your son. This is not a dance hall." The words cut the air like a whip. Charles Whitman, seated nearby, felt a flush of embarrassment rise. It was the first time he'd taken Ethan out in public since the accident that had left his son partially paralyzed. "Ethan, sit down," he ordered, trying to shut it all down. But Maria didn't move, not to retreat, not to obey. Instead, she quietly untied her apron and laid it gently on a tray. "I can't dance in an apron," she said calmly, then smiled and took Ethan's hand. What followed would ripple far beyond that dining room. It was just 3 dance steps, but they would spark the beginning of a transformation no one saw coming. Charles Whitman stood frozen beside his table. The stem of his wine glass caught between his fingers untouched. He watched as Maria Style, in her work shoes, her posture tall and composed, took Ethan's small, trembling hand and allowed him to lead. The moment felt both surreal and intimate, unfolding in a place more accustomed to silent staff and polished service than spontaneous humanity. Ethan's foot dragged slowly across the marble floor, the metal of his brace scraping sharply with each step. But Maria didn't rush him. She didn't guide or adjust him. She simply moved with him, matching his unsure rhythm, letting him take control. To everyone else it might have seemed a clumsy shuffle, but to Charles it was something else entirely. It was the first time he had seen his son attempt to move forward, not with assistance, not in therapy, but with confidence. A whisper rolled through the tables. "She's going to be fired tomorrow?" A woman in a silk blouse muttered to her date. But Maria didn't hear it, and if she did, she didn't care. Something in Ethan's face changed as the seconds passed. The fear that usually shadowed his expression softened. He looked focused, proud. For the first time in 2 years since the night of the crash that shattered both his legs and Charles' spirit, Ethan wasn't being helped, he was leading. That shift, subtle and profound, gripped Charles like a memory. He thought of his late wife, Caroline, who used to dance with Ethan barefoot in their living room. "It's not about perfection," Shed once told him, laughing. "It's about connection." The memory hit like a jolt to the heart. And now here was this stranger, this waitress, whom he'd barely noticed all evening, creating a moment that none of the therapists or specialists had been able to inspire. Just as Maria gently guided Ethan back to his table, after a brief but powerful 3-step sequence, the restaurant manager leaned in toward Charles and whispered with a sour edge, "I assure you this will never happen again. Shall be properly disciplined." The whole room seemed to tense, waiting to see how the powerful Mr. Whitman would respond. Charles said nothing. Not immediately. His eyes remained fixed on his son, on the lingering smile on Ethan's face. Then, as Maria turned to leave, Charles spoke. "Wait," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. Maria paused. "What's your full name?" he asked. "Maria Thompson," she replied. He repeated it as if committing it to memory. Then he reached into his blazer and handed her a sleek white business card. My office, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Every ear in the room perked up. But only Charles understood the truth in that moment. Something had shifted and he couldn't ignore it. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the towering glass atrium of Whitman Tower, painting golden slashes across the marble floor as Maria Thompson stepped through the revolving doors. Clad in a crisp navy skirt and a white blouse she had bought on clearance, she clutched her old handbag tightly and tried to steady the nerves dancing in her chest. The receptionists wore tailored blazers and glossy smiles, their eyes skimming over her with clinical detachment. Maria Thompson, here to see Mr. Whitman, she said, her voice even but quiet. After a curt nod and a brief phone call, she was directed to the 18th floor. Inside the elevator, Maria exhaled deeply and squared her shoulders. She had walked into worse situations in her life, harder rooms, more judgmental stares. But this was different. It wasn't fear she felt. It was determination. When she arrived, a tall woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze greeted her. I'm Ms. Langston. Mr. Whitman is finishing a call. This way, please. They moved through mirrored corridors that smelled of money and power. Maria felt the sideways glances of passing executives curious assessing. A black woman in the executive wing was enough of an anomaly to spark speculation. When they reached a small waiting area, Ms. Langston turned to her and asked bluntly, He had you fired, didn't he? Maria blinked. What? That's what happens, Langston said. People like you get called upstairs just to be let go cleanly. There was no venom in her voice, just tired realism. People like me? Maria asked not angrily, but with a measured lift of the brow. You know what I mean? Langston replied, adjusting her glasses. Staff who don't know their place. Before Maria could respond, a buzzer sounded. Hell see you now. Charles Whitman's office was a panoramic glass sanctuary with a view that made Manhattan look like a toy model. He stood at the window, hands in his pockets, the very image of controlled wealth. Ms. Thompson, he said, turning. Thank you for coming. He gestured to a chair, but Maria remained standing. Silence followed, long and deliberate. Charles finally broke it. Do you have a background? Excuse me, Maria asked. Education. Experience. Her gaze didn't flinch. Bachelor's in Child Development. Incomplete Master's in Special Education. NYU. His brow lifted, impressed despite himself. And you work as a waitress. I work 3 jobs, she said flatly. The restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, and tutoring whenever I can find students. Charles opened a folder on his desk, revealing photos of a modest community center. I did some research, he admitted. I wanted to understand the person who danced with my son. Her posture tightened. Then he said the words she didn't expect. I want you to work for me. Maria stared at him, stunned. As a waitress in your house? No, he said quietly, looking at a picture of Caroline holding a baby Ethan. As a therapeutic companion for Ethan. Maria remained silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The sunlight streaming through the panoramic windows framed her figure like a portrait, strong, poised, unwavering. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but resolute. No. The word landed like a hammer on marble, sending an almost imperceptible ripple through Charles Whitman's carefully composed demeanor. He blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me, he asked, not out of offense, but genuine confusion. No one told Charles Whitman, no, not in this building, not in his life. You heard me, Maria said, evenly, stepping away from the chair he had offered. I don't work for people who see my color or my pay stub before they see my competence. Charles' jaw tightened slightly. I didn't mean you didn't have to mean it, she cut in, but her tone never rose. You live it. You've built a world so high above the rest that people like me are either invisible or disposable. That's not the kind of environment I work in. Not anymore. He stepped around his desk, frustrated, but not angry. This isn't about you or me, Ms. Thompson. It's about Ethan. My son needs someone who can help him. Really help him. Mariah's eyes narrowed just slightly. And you think you can buy that help? Charles hesitated. I can pay you 5 times what you're making now. Her arms crossed slowly. And yet you can't pay for what Ethan truly needs. What do you think he needs? He asked, voice sharpening. Space, she replied. To lead. To stumble. To fail. He doesn't need more experts standing over him. He needs someone willing to walk beside him. She paused, then added with quiet finality, that person can't be someone who's hired to pretend they care. It has to be someone who actually does. Charles' face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with something deeper. Shame. Regret. Maybe even recognition. You don't know him, he said, not defensively, but almost pleading. No, Maria said, but I know what it's like to be underestimated. And I know people who've been boxed in by well-meaning people who mistake control for love. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. Freedom Steps, she said. We meet Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 p.m. First class is free if you want to bring Ethan. Then, with the grace of someone who had learned to survive by standing tall, Maria turned and walked out, leaving Charles Whitman alone in a room full of glass and reflections, none of which could show him what she just had. 3 days later, the Freedom Steps Community Center buzzed with life. Inside the modest brick building, children with braces, wheelchairs, and walking aids moved through the open studio space to the rhythm of a soft, playful beat. The walls hand-painted with phrases like, "Your rhythm, your rules, and every move counts," echoed with laughter and determination. At the front desk, Maria was adjusting a stack of name tags when her sister Zoe burst in, wide-eyed and breathless. There's a Bentley parked outside, she whispered, tugging at her headscarf. And you won't believe who's inside it. Maria didn't need to look. She already knew. Through the window, she could see Ethan's small face peeking nervously from the back seat. But what truly caught her breath was the driver's side door slowly opening and Charles Whitman stepping out. Gone were the tailored suit and polished shoes. Instead, he wore a sweater and slacks, looking like a man trying and failing not to stand out. He hesitated at the curb, gripping the steering wheel, as though unsure whether to step into this unfamiliar world. He's not coming in, Zoe said under her breath. Men like him don't set foot in places like this. But Maria only smiled, watching Ethan fiddle with the strap of his brace. Don't underestimate the power of a determined son, she murmured. Moments later, the car door swung open. Ethan stepped out carefully, adjusting his leg support. And then, to everyone's surprise, including his own father, he started making his way toward the entrance. Charles followed slowly and stiffly, like a man walking into a courtroom instead of a dance studio. Maria opened the door before they could knock. Welcome, she said simply, wearing jeans and a soft tee bearing the Freedom Steps logo. The space around her radiated warmth, energy, and purpose. Inside, Ethan's eyes widened at the sight of children like him moving freely to the music, some spinning in wheelchairs, others rhythmically hopping on prosthetic legs. It looks chaotic, Charles muttered as he surveyed the room, visibly uncomfortable. There is structure, Maria replied gently. It's just not the kind you're used to. She knelt to Ethan's level. Would you like to join them? The boy nodded eagerly, but glanced at his father first. Charles hesitated, then finally gave a stiff nod. Go on, he said. He'll be right here. As Ethan shuffled toward the group, Mariah's sister Zoe approached Charles and offered a folding chair. "The first day's always the hardest," she said kindly. "For the parents, not the kids." Charles sat silent, the rhythmic thump of music surrounding him, like a language he didn't yet understand, but one he might be ready to learn. Just as Charles settled into his seat, still trying to make sense of the unfamiliar world around him, the studio door opened once more. An older woman with silver-streaked braids and an ornate cane stepped inside, moving with a quiet authority that silenced even the most energetic children mid-step. Her presence drew immediate attention, not from spectacle, but from the gravity she carried. Zoe leaned toward Charles and whispered with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. "That's Dr. Elaine Mercer, neuroscientist from Harvard. She retired 2 years ago." Charles blinked, startled. "What is she doing here?" "She runs the research program connected to Freedom Steps," Zoe explained. "We're studying how non-directive movement affects neuroplasticity in kids with mobility challenges." As Dr. Mercer made her way across the studio, she paused briefly to greet several children by name, smiling warmly before her sharp eyes landed on Charles. "Mr. Whitman," she said with neither judgment nor admiration in her voice. Just acknowledgement. "Didn't expect to see you here." He stood clearing his throat. "I wasn't aware you were involved in this." "I know," she replied. "You rejected my proposal 3 times. Maria re-entered just then, walking beside a girl in a wheelchair who was executing an elegant spin with the help of the beat. "Freedom Steps," she explained, "is more than a dance class. It's a pilot rehab program. We use movement autonomy. Kids decide how to move, and we observe how it affects their neural development." Charles looked at her, narrowing his eyes. "You lead a research program, but you wait tables." Maria didn't flinch, "because the funding didn't come. And because your foundation turned us down." Dr. Mercer stepped in, her voice calm, but resolute. "Maria was my co-author. She had to leave her master's program to care for her sister. But make no mistake, her work is original, groundbreaking." Something clicked in Charles' mind. "You knew who I was at the restaurant," he murmured. Maria met his gaze without hesitation. "From the moment you walked in. And when Ethan asked me to dance, I saw a chance to show you, because explaining it didn't work." Charles' eyes flicked toward the children again, especially Ethan, who was now laughing as he imitated the bounce of another child's step. "So that dance was it staged?" "Not at all," Maria said softly. He stood up. "I chose to follow." Before Charles could respond, the door opened once more, this time not with researchers, but reporters. The quiet hum of conversation was replaced by the staccato of camera shutters. Charles' face stiffened. "Is this part of your plan?" Zoe handed him a glossy magazine. On its cover, "Revolutionary Motor Rehab Method Shows Promising Results." Maria didn't speak. She didn't need to. The truth had already begun speaking for itself. Charles Whitman stood still as the sound of camera shutters echoed through the studio. His instincts screamed at him to shut this down, to demand the reporters leave, to pull Ethan out and regain control of the narrative. But then he saw his son. Not just walking, not just participating, but glowing. Ethan had removed one of his leg braces, something no therapist had ever recommended, and was carefully trying to balance on one support. Panic surged in Charles' chest. He started forward, but Maria gently placed a hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Watch him." Ethan took a shaky breath, steadied himself, and then, right there in the center of the room, took a full step. One leg, no brace. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The step wasn't long. It wasn't perfect. But it was his. The children around him began clapping, cheering softly. Camera flashes lit up the moment, and Charles, so often poised and unreadable, felt something rise up in his throat. His eyes burned. He looked away, blinking hard. "That's why we created Freedom Steps," Maria said. Beside him, her voice quiet and full of emotion. It's not about perfect steps. It's about first steps on your own, son. For the first time, Charles didn't see Ethan as fragile as broken. He didn't see a child to be managed or rehabilitated into some preconceived standard. He saw a person becoming himself, guided not by force, but by trust. He turned toward Maria slowly, his voice low. This could have been done without the theatrics, without manipulating me. Maria looked at him, not unkindly. It could have if you'd answered our calls, if you'd read our proposals. She glanced at the reporters now clustering behind a velvet rope trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. But you didn't, so I found another way. Charles didn't argue. He couldn't. As he looked back at Ethano trying the same step again with a friend encouraging him, he saw something no amount of money or professional consultation had been able to achieve belief. Not the kind people place in others, but the kind that grows within when someone is finally allowed to lead. He stood there, torn between two realities. The one he'd always ruled with wealth and control, and this new one built on vulnerability, courage, and the wisdom of letting go. For the first time in years, he had no idea what came next. And that terrified him almost as much as it humbled him. As the applause faded, and the reporters slowly backed away, sensing that they had already captured the headline of the day, Charles Whitman remained rooted in place. For a man who had built a life orchestrated to the second dominated boardrooms and controlled fortunes with a signature, the unfamiliar silence within himself was unnerving. Maria led him quietly into an adjoining room just off the studio, a makeshift gallery lined with photographs of children, each image marked with handwritten notes of milestones. First time standing unaided, completed 5 minutes of movement without cueing, laughed during solo improvisation. At the end of the wall hung a large, empty frame. Charles studied it, then asked, "What's this one?" Maria didn't hesitate. Our future, the full rehabilitation center we could build with the right resources, a space that could serve 500 kids a year instead of 50. He turned to her slowly, something dawning in his expression. "You orchestrated all of this, didn't you? The dance, the meeting, bringing me here on press day." "I saw an opportunity," Maria said, calm but direct. 4 months ago, when your foundation rejected our proposal without reading it, I made a promise to myself. I would find a way to show you what we do." She paused, then added, "And show Ethan what he's capable of." Just then, Zoe burst into the room. "It's Ethan," she said urgently. They rushed back to the studio. In the center, Ethan stood with his friends around him, his face determined, his breathing deep. One of the music instructors had turned off the background beat, and the room had gone still. Ethan, no longer wearing either brace, stood balanced on one leg, carefully shifting his weight. His arms extended slightly for focus. A second passed, then another. And then he stepped. Just one step clean and unassisted. The studio erupted in cheers. Children clapped wildly. A few parents wiped their eyes. Cameras flashed again, but this time Charles didn't care. He didn't flinch or look for an escape. He was too focused on his son. Maria leaned toward him. That's what Ethan needed. Not more control, not better specialists, just the space to try and someone willing to follow. Charles' eyes glistened, but he didn't speak. Not yet. He was watching Ethan, his boy, stand in the center of the room with a proud, almost startled smile. For the first time, Charles wasn't the man delivering the solution. He was simply the witness to a breakthrough money could never buy. And it changed everything. The weight of the moment settled over Charles like a long-forgotten truth. He stood in stunned silence, watching his son beam with a confidence that had been absent since the accident. Around them, reporters began to stir again, their whispers rising in urgency. Cameras turned this time not just toward Ethan, but to Charles. A young journalist stepped forward, voice cautious but clear. "Mr. Whitman, could you comment on your presence at Freedom Steps today? Is it true your foundation rejected this program 3 times?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Charles glanced at Maria, who said nothing, her posture calm, steady. Then his eyes drifted to Ethan, who was now helping another child figure out how to stand without his crutches. Charles took a breath, turned to face the cameras fully, and most shocking of all, smiled. "You know what's hardest for someone in my position?" he asked aloud, his voice steady but uncharacteristically sincere. "Admitting when we're wrong." A murmur swept through the room. The reporters leaned forward. Even Zoe froze mid-step near the door. Charles continued. "The Montgomery Foundation is pleased to announce a full 5-year commitment to fund Freedom Steps, including the construction of a permanent rehabilitation center based on the methodology developed by Dr. Elaine Mercer and Ms. Maria Thompson." The cameras clicked in a frenzy, and on one condition he added, pausing, as Mariah's brow rose. "That Ms. Thompson retains full autonomy over the program and its principles, no corporate interference. We don't get to redefine the mission. We support it." The room erupted. Reporters shouting questions, children clapping, staff exchanging wide-eyed glances. Zoe let out an audible gasp, while Maria stood frozen for a second, before slowly nodding, acknowledging the gravity of what had just happened. In that moment, Charles Whitman didn't look like a billionaire or a boardroom shark. He looked like a man who had finally set down the armor he'd worn for too long. A man who had realized that leadership didn't always mean being out front. It meant knowing when to step back and let others lead the way. Ethan, hearing the commotion, turned and looked at his father with curious eyes. Charles walked over, dropped to one knee beside him, and said, "You did that, buddy." Ethan tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Charles smiled again. "You showed me a better way." And for the first time in his adult life, Charles felt what it meant to follow. 3 months later, the sound of bulldozers echoed across a vacant lot on the city's west side as construction began on the new Freedom Steps Rehabilitation Center. It wasn't the flashiest project the Montgomery Foundation had ever funded, but it was by far the most innovative. Every detail was designed with the children in mind, from accessible dance studios flooded with natural light to sensory gardens for therapeutic play. Maria walked the site daily, clipboard in hand, often joined by Ethan, who now moved confidently with just a lightweight brace and a cane on difficult days. Charles appeared regularly, too often in casual clothes, and carrying not a phone, but a notebook filled with his own scribbled thoughts on neuroplasticity. He no longer came as a patron, but as a father who had learned to listen. And when Ethan led a choreographed routine at the center's soft opening, Charles watched from the back of the room, not guiding, not correcting, just being there. The greatest lesson Charles learned wasn't about money science or control it. Was this true leadership begins when we stop trying to shape others and start letting them shape us. Whether you're a parent, a boss, or a friend, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step aside and let someone else lead the dance. If this story moved you, leave us a comment below. What moment made your heart stop? And if you believe in the power of listening, growing, and letting go, hit that subscribe button to follow more stories that prove dignity and love can change lives.